March 30th, 1972. The hour was just past noon. Along a bleak stretch of land called the Demilitarized Zone, the border dividing Vietnam since the 1954 Geneva Accords, the sky suddenly tore open. Artillery came first. Thousands of shells. Heavy barrages pounding every South Vietnamese firebase below the 17th parallel. Within hours, the earth shook as 14 North Vietnamese Infantry Divisions, 26 regiments, over 120,000 soldiers, and roughly 1,200 tanks pushed south. It was the largest conventional military operation of the entire Vietnam conflict. Down in Saigon, the Republic of Vietnam's capital, word hit Independence Palace in under an hour. Standing in a quiet, polished office, the man at the center of that palace listened. 48 years old, President of the Republic of Vietnam for 4.5 years, commanding over 1 million soldiers. The reports piling onto his desk confirmed a nightmare no previous South Vietnamese leader had faced. Not a guerrilla uprising, not border raids, a sheer invasion. A massive conventional assault rolled across an international boundary, targeting a nation whose American ally had already pulled out most of its combat troops. His entire adult life was preparation for a moment exactly like this. He had climbed the ranks of 3 distinct armies, survived multiple coups, outplayed every rival standing in his way. He signed land reforms that even the New York Times praised, and armed 4 million civilians. Through it all, he won elections, lost brutal battles, took American money while defying American pressure, and stubbornly held together a nation the rest of the world kept writing off. In the bitter years ahead, he would clash with 2 of the war's most powerful Americans. He would make a choice that almost saved his country, sign a treaty he utterly despised, and hold the line for nearly 3 more years. Then, during his final weeks in power, he would make a single strategic gamble, one the Republic of Vietnam would never survive. We do not just read history here on ARVN and United States Military, we step right into it. These accounts built one of the 20th century's most defining, complicated conflicts. If you are new to the channel, make sure to subscribe. You really do not want to miss this one. Stick around until the end. What happened to this leader over those years exposes hard truths about loyalty and the crushing weight of command. Things history books have debated for half a century, yet still cannot settle. Leave a comment below. What do you believe ultimately defined Nguyen Van Thieu? The solid achievements he built, or the decisions that brought all of it crashing down? His full name was Nguyen Van Thieu. To understand how he ended up in that palace when the Great Offensive hit, we have to go backward. Back to a much younger man, back to a choice he made at just 23, a choice that mapped out the rest of his life. That decision arrived during the summer of 1946. He was a slender kid from Phan Rang, a coastal town in Ninh Thuận province, deep inside what was then French Indochina. The Second World War had barely finished. The occupying Japanese Empire was gone, and the French were marching back to reclaim their colony. Meanwhile, a revolutionary movement called the Viet Minh, guided by a man named Ho Chi Minh, had boldly declared Vietnamese independence. Young Nguyen Van Thieu signed right up with them. He took the oath, trained deep in the jungle with other boys, learning the rough basics of soldiering. They had no rifles at first, just sharpened bamboo staves used for drills. But his sharp instincts stood out fast. Within months, commanders made him a district chief, handing him genuine authority over a slice of liberated land. Then, almost as quickly as he joined, he walked away. He recounted the story often in later years, never changing the details. He claimed he saw the Viet Minh executing people, watched them tear apart the village councils that had run local life for generations, saw them seizing farmers' land. By August 1946, he decided the movement was fundamentally communist, and their so-called nationalism was just a mask hiding a much darker political agenda. So he left them behind, slipping quietly back into Saigon. He leaned on his older brother, Nguyen Van Thieu. The older man helped him enroll at the Merchant Marine School. By 1948, he earned an officer's commission, but the French shipping firm planned to pay him far less than French officers holding the exact same rank. He flatly turned it down. That single insult shifted the course of his life. He refused to be a colonial subject, and he was not going back to the Viet Minh. Instead, he took a third option, a route hundreds of thousands of young Vietnamese men chose back then. He joined the Vietnamese National Army. This was a new force under the state of Vietnam, built by the French to counter the insurgents, technically allied to Paris through the French Union. On October 1st, 1948, he reported to the Vietnamese National Military Academy up in Hue, the ancient imperial capital. He joined the very first class of officer candidates they ever produced. Initially named Qua Bao Dai after the former emperor, the class was later retitled Qua Phan Boi Cho, honoring one of Vietnam's most famous nationalist thinkers. 9 grueling months of training followed. Tactics, weaponry, infantry discipline, leadership theory. He soaked it all in. Instructors viewed him as capable and methodical, not particularly flashy, but incredibly steady and observant. He listened hard, took endless notes. Fellow officers said he analyzed people the way a mechanic studies an engine, always watching how the pieces locked together, always hunting for the leverage. By June 1949, he pinned on second lieutenant bars. His first post sent him south to lead a platoon in Ma Khe, a small Mekong Delta town in Binh Tre province. It was a suffocating maze of canals, rice paddies, and heavy brush. The Viet Minh owned the area, striking from hidden camps, ambushing patrols, then vanishing back among the farmers. Leading men into that landscape, he learned command. He felt the weight of choices made on terrible intelligence, fighting an enemy indistinguishable from the locals. Weeks later, the army shipped him to France for advanced training at the École Spéciale Militaire de Saint-Cyr Quet-Quidan, the legendary academy that shaped generations of officers for the Armée de Terre. He spent months soaking up European military doctrine, mastering the complex language of combined arms warfare that would eventually define his career. Returning to Indochina, he held a distinct advantage over his peers. He knew this war from 3 radically different angles. He had served inside the Viet Minh, stood on a French commercial deck, sat inside the elite classrooms of the French army. Unlike most officers beside him, he knew this was not just a straight fight between colonial masters and local rebels. It was a dense, fractured war of competing ideologies, foreign backers, and wildly different visions for Vietnam's future. By early 1951, his rise really accelerated. Promoted to first lieutenant, he took a tactical command course in Hanoi before becoming an instructor for platoon candidates at the military academy, which had recently moved out of Hue up into the cool mountain air of Dalat. 28 years old, a rising star in a young army still leashed to French commanders, the First Indochina War was rushing toward its brutal climax. The bloody siege of Dien Bien Phu was 3 years off. The Geneva Accords even further. The Republic of Vietnam, the very country he would one day rule, did not even exist yet. But the man destined to be its second president was fully in motion. The critical choices driving him toward Independence Palace were already locked in. His instincts, shrewd, intensely patient, and heavily self-preserving, were hardening into the very traits his peers would eventually define with 2 opposing words: cautious, ambitious. War would mold him. The military would educate him. and politics would ultimately seduce him. In the years ahead, he would meet his future wife, convert to her faith, and take command of a whole division. Then, on a dark November night in 1963, he would find himself standing outside a burning presidential palace, watching an entire nation change hands. That night was still over 10 years out, but the path leading to it was already opening right under his feet. He crossed paths with her in the summer of 1951. Her name was Nguyen Van Thieu. 21 years old, the seventh of 10 children, born to a wealthy Catholic family in the Mekong Delta town of My Tho. Her father practiced traditional medicine. Everyone who knew her used the same childhood nickname, Ko Bai, or Miss Seven, marking her exact place in the family line. She was working in Saigon back then as a pharmaceutical representative for the Roussel Pharmaceutical Institute. A pharmacist named Nguyen Van Thieu knew both families and set up the introduction. There was another link too. One of Mai An's uncles, a man named Dang Van Quang, had trained with the young lieutenant at the Vietnamese National Military Academy. Quang would eventually become a lieutenant general and decades later, National Security Advisor to the President of the Republic of Vietnam. But in the summer of 1951, he was just a fellow officer vouching for a friend. They married later that year. The match took some negotiation. She was Roman Catholic, while he grew up in a Buddhist household. They reached a quiet compromise. She kept her faith, and he held off on converting. The matter would be revisited later. A daughter came first. Nguyen Tuan An followed, eventually by two sons, Nguyen Quang Loc and Nguyen Thieu Long. The family destined to live inside Independence Palace had officially begun. The year he married, the young officer took a post at the National Military Academy at Dalat, training Class 5 platoon candidates. With its pine forests and cool air, the mountain city felt entirely removed from the sweltering Mekong rice paddies. He passed down to younger men the exact lessons he had just learned. The cycle of military education kept turning. By the following year, he had finished an advanced battalion command course in Hanoi and secured a promotion to captain. He was quickly reassigned to the Hung Yen Front Command in the northern delta region of Tonkin. There, he served alongside two specific officers whose careers would intersect with his for decades. One was a lieutenant named Nguyen Van Thieu, a man who would one day serve as chairman of the Joint General Staff of the Republic of Vietnam military forces for his entire presidency. The other was Captain Do Mo, destined for the highest levels of military intelligence. At Hung Yen, these three men held the core of the command structure. Do Mo served as chief of staff. The future president held the operations chair, and Nguyen Van Thieu ran intelligence. By 1954, the major commanded the 11th Infantry Mobile Group. Then came a rather brutal twist of fate. His unit led an operation against Viet Minh fighters dug into his actual home village in Ninh Thuận province. Those fighters were holding out inside the very house where he grew up. According to his official biography, he gave the order to assault the position anyway. The Viet Minh were driven out, and his childhood home was blown apart in the crossfire. He never showed any public regret. For his supporters, it became the defining moment, the exact day he proved with total finality whose side he was really on. That same year, the First Indochina War finally ended. By spring, the French garrison at Dien Bien Phu surrendered to the Viet Minh after 56 agonizing days under siege. Summer brought the Geneva Accords, slicing Vietnam clean in half at the 17th parallel. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh took control of the north. Down south, Emperor Bao Dai led the state of Vietnam, waiting on scheduled elections that would never actually happen. The French were packing up. In Saigon, a Catholic nationalist named Ngo Dinh Diem was busy forming a brand new government. At the same time, the Vietnamese National Army was shifting into a fresh military force built for an entirely new nation. That nation was the Republic of Vietnam. Its military became the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, forever known from that point on as the ARVN. In 1955, the newly minted lieutenant colonel stepped into a role carrying serious prestige. He became commander of the National Military Academy at Dalat, the very place forging officers for the new South Vietnamese state. He used to teach there as a junior officer. Now, he was running the whole show. 2 years later, the United States government started paying attention. By July 1957, they sent him to the Army Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. For American soldiers, this course was the primary gateway to senior command, and they saw it as vital training for the rising stars of their allies. He spent months out at Fort Leavenworth studying American doctrine. He absorbed the language and the cold logic of an army that was about to become the heaviest foreign presence in his homeland. Returning to Dalat in 1958, he took back command of the National Military Academy. That same year, after 7 years of marriage, he was baptized into the Roman Catholic Church, taking the baptismal name Martino. Faith was a personal choice, sure, but in the political climate of the First Republic, it was deeply useful. President Ngo Dinh Diem and his family were devoutly Catholic. The upper tiers of the South Vietnamese government and military heavily favored Catholics. An officer with American training, a solid reputation, and the right religion. That was exactly the kind of man destined to rise. And his ascent kept right on going. The following year, he shipped out to Okinawa, the American island base in the East China Sea, for advanced combat intelligence training. Upon returning, he made colonel and secured the operations chief role at the Joint General Staff in Saigon. Then came a second American training stint, this time focused squarely on air defense at Fort Bliss, Texas. By the early months of 1961, he finally secured his first divisional command. He took the reins of the ARVN First Infantry Division, headquartered near Hue in the northern provinces. He held that post for roughly a year and a half. Then, in late 1962, he transferred to lead the Fifth Infantry Division out of Bien Hoa, just north of Saigon. This division occupied incredibly strategic ground, with its troops effectively surrounding the capital. Any man commanding that much firepower so close to the center occupied a position of profound political consequence. To understand the weight of his situation, one must look at the fractures tearing the country apart. The First Republic of Vietnam was facing an existential crisis. The leadership leaned heavily on family loyalists, exclusive networks, and a rigorous security apparatus that sought to stifle dissent. The Buddhist majority, representing a vast segment of the population, felt increasingly alienated from the state. By the summer of 1963, these mounting tensions reached a critical boiling point. A public event in a major Saigon intersection shocked the global conscience, with the imagery appearing on the front pages of newspapers around the world. Watching this situation unfold was the United States government under President John F. Kennedy, with thousands of American military advisors already deployed across South Vietnam. Massive amounts of American money kept pouring in. By late summer of 1963, senior Kennedy officials came to a grim conclusion. The Diem government was now actively getting in the way of the fight against the communist insurgency. Behind closed doors, senior ARVN generals began to plot. The commander of the 5th Infantry Division was someone they absolutely had to have. Taking Saigon without him was impossible. His division was the closest major strike force to the capital. Those tanks, that heavy armor, the infantry, and crucially, his willingness to unleash them would decide whether this coup attempt lived or died. American diplomatic cables from the time suggest he was pretty reluctant at first. He certainly wasn't an early architect of this mutiny. He had served the First Republic faithfully for nearly a decade, rising straight up through its patronage network. Back in November 1960, when rogue paratroopers tried to oust President Diem, he had fought to defend the regime. Now, the new plotters wanted to tear that exact same order to the ground. But by the autumn of 1963, the math was changing. The generals pushing this plot were some of the most powerful officers in the ARVN. Everyone understood that the American ambassador, Henry Cabot Lodge, quietly supported the move. Signals out of Washington hinted that the Kennedy administration would simply step aside. Staying loyal to the Diem government in that kind of climate felt like betting everything on a dying horse. So he made his choice. He was in by late October. The conspiracy entered its final phase. A date was set. The roles were locked in. The Fifth Infantry Division was chosen as the primary spearhead to strike the absolute heart of the capital, and its commander would be leading the charge himself. Autumn nights in Saigon were heavy and warm. The streets stayed deceptively quiet. In the city center, the presidential compound known as Gia Long Palace sat hidden behind thick walls. Inside those walls, President Diem and his brother Nhu went about their usual business, fully aware that tensions were spiking, but completely blind to just how close the wolves really were. The colonel commanding the 5th Infantry Division finalized his orders, briefed his men, reviewed the maps one last time, and waited for the signal. That signal finally arrived on the morning of November 1st, 1963. By sunset, the First Republic of Vietnam and the very men who built it would be completely gone. Dawn broke over Saigon on November 1st, 1963. It was the Feast of All Saints, a holy day for President Ngo Dinh Diem and his brother, political counselor Ngo Dinh Nhu. Both attended morning mass. The capital's streets seemed quiet. American advisors went about their usual routines, while diplomats prepared for lunch. Meanwhile, Gia Long Palace sat firmly behind its iron gates in the city center, complete with gardens, grand staircases, and a fairly modest defensive guard. At exactly 1300 hours, the military coup began. Leading it was a tight group of senior generals whose names would echo through Vietnamese history for decades. General Nguyen Van Thieu, known across the army as Big Men, became the public face of the plot. General Ton Van Doan acted as political architect, while General Ton Tuc Ding of the 3rd Corps controlled troop movements around the capital. Others, like General Lê Van Kim and General Mai Hu Xuan, played key supporting roles. Crucially, the 5th Infantry Division commander, promoted just 11 months prior, had agreed to provide the actual striking force meant to seize the palace. His division moved in from Bien Hoa, just north of the city. Meanwhile, Marines, paratroopers, and armored cavalry converged on key targets across Saigon: the radio station, the post office, the Special Forces headquarters, commanded by a Diem loyalist. By mid-afternoon, the rebels controlled nearly the entire capital. Only Gia Long Palace held out, defended by a small handful of loyal troops. Inside the palace, President Diem and his brother Nhu scrambled to the phones. They tried reaching General Ton Tuc Ding, hoping for rescue, but he never answered. So they called the American ambassador, Henry Cabot Lodge. Lodge listened, offering safe passage but absolutely no military intervention. The lifeline never came. The palace siege dragged on through the night. Artillery hammered the compound, while infantry advanced across the gardens. By the early hours of November 2nd, the defenders finally surrendered. President Diem and Nhu had actually slipped out through a tunnel, making their way to a Catholic church in the Chu Lon district. The next morning, they gave themselves up to rebel forces, only to be loaded into an armored personnel carrier for transport to military headquarters. They never arrived alive. According to later investigations, the two brothers were killed right inside that vehicle. Their hands had been completely bound. A young officer named Nguyen Van Thieu carried out the executions, acting on orders historians still passionately debate today. General Nguyen Van Minh strictly denied ordering their deaths, whilst other accounts point the finger elsewhere. The killings genuinely shocked the world. Over in Washington, President John Fitzgerald Kennedy was reportedly visibly disturbed by the sudden slaughter of men America had so recently considered indispensable allies. For the colonel commanding the Fifth Infantry Division's assault, the immediate reward was a swift promotion. He became a two-star major general, the entry-level general officer grade for the ARVN at the time. He also secured a seat on the Military Revolutionary Council, the group of senior generals now ruling the Republic of Vietnam in place of the murdered president. The First Republic was dead. The Second had not yet been born. And so, the country plunged into a dark period of political instability that would drag on for 18 months. Just 3 weeks after the Saigon coup, President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. American policy towards Vietnam immediately passed to his successor, Lyndon Baines Johnson. The new administration would deepen its support for the South Vietnamese war effort, even as it grew increasingly frustrated by the chaotic revolving door governments emerging in Saigon. That Military Revolutionary Council ruled for barely 3 short months. At dawn on January 30th, 1964, another coup unfolded, this time without a drop of blood. It was led by General Nguyen Van, a corps commander sidelined during the November plot, who felt he deserved far more influence. The major general who stormed Gia Long Palace joined Khan's effort alongside General Tren Thien Kiem and Colonels Nguyen Van Thieu and Do Mo. Ironically, the general who executed the No brothers in the armored vehicle was killed during this operation, the single fatality of the entire day. The plotters justified the takeover by claiming the current junta planned a neutralist accommodation with the Democratic Republic of Vietnam up north. Whether that was actually true remains unsettled. What the coup undeniably achieved was elevating General Khan to national leadership, whilst further promoting the man who would one day become president. Under Khan, he juggled a series of overlapping roles: Secretary General of the Military Revolutionary Council, Chief of the Joint General Staff, Deputy Minister of Defense. Every single title carried weight, keeping him right at the center of decision-making. By autumn, after more reshuffling, he took command of the Fourth Corps, controlling the vast Mekong Delta region. Meanwhile, leadership of the Joint General Staff passed to his old colleague from the Hung Yen Front, General Cao Van Vien. Meanwhile, the entire country was slowly disintegrating politically. In August 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin incident prompted the United States Congress to pass the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, handing President Johnson broad authority to wage war across Southeast Asia. American combat involvement was poised for massive escalation. But back in Saigon, the government changed hands so fast that American officials could barely keep track. General Khan tried consolidating power, only to face fierce pushback from Buddhist activists, students, and rival factions. A short-lived coup attempt kicked off in September, before another erupted in February 1965. It was right through this chaotic period that he finally began outmaneuvering his rivals. Promoted to lieutenant general by early 1965, he served briefly as second deputy prime minister under Tren Van Huong. He then stepped up as first deputy prime minister for Phan Huy Quat, whilst also acting as minister of the armed forces. Unlike Khan, he deeply understood that surviving Saigon didn't require flashy leadership. It required quietly hoarding allies, managing fragile factions, and simply waiting in the wings while others overplayed their hands. And Khan absolutely overplayed his. By February 1965, rival factions had forced him out of power. He fled the country, settled abroad, and permanently vanished from the South Vietnamese political chessboard. Next, the civilian government of Phan Huy Quat tried to take the reins. They completely failed. By the summer of 1965, the cabinet collapsed, and authority defaulted right back to the military. On June 14, 1965, senior ARVN generals met to map out the next government. They set up two distinct bodies. The National Leadership Committee would act as a collective head of state, while the Central Executive Committee functioned as the cabinet. Chairmanship of the Leadership Committee, effectively making him head of state, went to the lieutenant general who had spent 19 months quietly sitting at the center of every coup, reshuffle, and power grab. Meanwhile, the Executive Committee chairmanship, equivalent to Prime Minister, was handed to a much younger, flashier officer named Air Marshal Nguyen Van Thieu. Ky was just 34. As commander of the Republic of Vietnam Air Force, he was famously flamboyant, known for lavender flight scarves, incredibly fast cars, and aggressive public statements. In almost every visible way, he was the polar opposite of the cautious, highly calculating infantryman he now shared power with. They were bitter rivals. They would always remain rivals. But on that particular summer afternoon, they stood shoulder to shoulder and announced a brand new government. American leadership in both Saigon and Washington watched this unfold with cautious optimism. President Lyndon Johnson had already committed to massive ground troop deployments 2 months prior. The 3rd Marine Amphibious Force had landed at Da Nang in March, with the 1st Infantry and 1st Cavalry Divisions soon to follow. By the end of 1965, over 180,000 American troops would be stationed in South Vietnam. This was no longer just a Vietnamese conflict with American advisors. It was rapidly becoming an American war, fought on Vietnamese soil, alongside a fragile local government. That government, as fragile as it was, finally had a face. 2 faces, actually. And everyone in Saigon and Washington was asking the exact same question. Could this strange new arrangement hold? Could a cautious general from Phan Rang and a flashy Northern Air Marshal keep the country together long enough for America to fight and win the escalating war? The answer unfolded over the following 2 years. It played out in Honolulu conference rooms, on the island of Guam, and on election ballots across South Vietnam. Ultimately, closed-door negotiations slowly concentrated power into the hands of one man instead of 2. The first major test of this new partnership arrived exactly 8 months later, February 1966. President Lyndon Baines Johnson summoned the chairman of the National Leadership and Central Executive Committees to Oahu, Hawaii. They met at Camp Smith, headquarters of the United States Pacific Command, for 3 days, starting on the 6th of February. These 2 South Vietnamese leaders sat directly across from the American president. Alongside him sat Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, Secretary of State Dean Rusk, and the senior commanders running the American war effort. This conference produced a document that became known as the Declaration of Honolulu. It committed both governments to a shared agenda: defeat the communist insurgency, build genuine constitutional democracy, conquer hunger, illiteracy, and disease across the South Vietnamese countryside. Finally, pursue reconciliation and peace. For the South Vietnamese head of state, this summit was a formative moment. He sat as an equal across from the President of the United States. He was treated as the delegation's senior figure, even though the Air Marshal, serving as Prime Minister, spoke much more often during public sessions. Ambassador Ellsworth Bunker, who later became the senior American diplomat in Saigon, watched him closely. Bunker observed a man who was quieter, far more measured, and deliberate compared to his colorful colleague. Now, the Honolulu commitments had to become reality. a constitution written, elections held. Ever since President Diem was killed 3 years earlier, the Republic of Vietnam had relied on provisional military arrangements. It finally had to become a functioning constitutional state. The actual work of writing that constitution began in autumn 1966. A constituent assembly was elected on September 11th. South Vietnamese voters chose 117 delegates from across the country. They represented the political, religious, and regional factions not yet silenced by war. Together, they drafted a document modeled on Western parliamentary systems. It established a bicameral legislature, a Supreme Court, an independent judiciary, and a powerful executive presidency. It promised civil liberties, religious freedom, and protection from arbitrary detention. It also strictly outlawed communism and neutralism. On April 1st, 1967, the new constitution took effect. The Republic of Vietnam formally became a presidential republic. Transitional military bodies, including the National Leadership Committee he chaired for nearly 2 years, would dissolve and an elected president was inaugurated. The election was scheduled for September 3rd, 1967. For the provisional head of state, running for president was no longer the question. The challenge was managing his own senior generals, preventing them from derailing his candidacy from within. The air marshal serving as prime minister also intended to run. They had operated as partners for almost 2 years, but always out of pure necessity, never affection. Senior military leaders convened in the early summer of 1967. According to multiple participants, the discussions were tense, drawn out, and occasionally hostile. Yet, they finally reached an arrangement. The lieutenant general would head the ticket for president. The air marshal would accept the vice presidency. In exchange, a behind-the-scenes military committee, theoretically controlled by the air marshal, would shape government policy from outside the formal executive branch. This compromise fully satisfied absolutely no one. The air marshal later called accepting that vice presidency the biggest political mistake of his entire life. What followed was the first truly competitive presidential election in the country's history. 11 candidates made the ballot. The opposition featured former civilian Prime Minister Nguyen Van Thieu, Buddhist-aligned attorney Truong Dinh Dzu, and various regional and intellectual figures. But the campaign unfolded under severe wartime conditions. The communist insurgency demanded a total boycott. Threats of violence against polling stations echoed across the country. American observers, a mix of journalists, congressmen, and election monitors, traveled all the way to South Vietnam to decide if the process was actually free, fair, and credible. When the ballots were tallied, the military ticket finished first. Preliminary counts gave the lieutenant general roughly 34.8% of the vote. The final certified numbers climbed slightly, hitting 35% in some tallies, 38% in others. Turnout reached an impressive 83.17% of registered voters. That figure was considerably higher than participation rates in many established democracies of that era. The result's legitimacy was contested almost immediately. Several losing candidates filed protests with the Constituent Assembly, launching hearings into voting irregularities. Yet, by a very narrow margin, the Assembly certified the result on October 2nd. Truong Dinh Dzu, the opposition candidate who finished a surprising second by promising peace negotiations, was later arrested. He spent years in prison. For the man now elected as the second president of the Republic of Vietnam, certification opened an entirely new chapter. He was no longer a general leading a military junta. He was the elected head of a constitutional republic. This transition demanded institutional restructuring, yes, but also a fundamental shift in how he wielded power. October 31st, 1967. The inauguration took place in Saigon, at the newly rebuilt Independence Palace. The original had been bombed during the November 1963 coup, designed by Vietnamese architect Viet Minh, This new building became both the working presidential office and a powerful symbol of the Second Republic. The new president was just 44 years old. He wore the formal attire of his office, his wife standing quietly beside him. She was now First Lady of the Republic of Vietnam, succeeding the flamboyant Madame Tran Le Xuan, whose de facto tenure ended violently 4 years earlier. This new First Lady came from a Catholic family in My Tho. She charted an entirely different course, focusing heavily on humanitarian work instead of political influence. The vice president took his oath alongside the president. A new cabinet was swiftly sworn in. The institutions of the Second Republic of Vietnam were formally running. Inside Independence Palace, work started immediately. The president made early appointments to the cabinet, provincial administrations, and military commands. He kept General Nguyen Van Thieu as chairman of the Joint General Staff, a vital role Viet held for over 7 years. The president also confirmed senior generals in their commands. Crucially, he cultivated relationships with the American ambassador and General William Childs Westmoreland, the man leading the United States military effort in Vietnam since the summer of 1964. Westmoreland and the new president kept things highly professional and respectful, if not particularly warm. Westmoreland commanded all American military operations in the South. Despite the obvious weaknesses of certain ARVN generals, he constantly refused to push for a unified command structure. Instead, the Allied militaries relied on official coordination. This meant an advisor network where every ARVN unit larger than a company had an American counterpart attached. At the very top, Westmoreland personally acted as the principal advisor to General Viet. American troop presence grew massively in the months right before the inauguration. By the end of 1967, over 480,000 American personnel were stationed in South Vietnam. They fought alongside 700,000 soldiers from the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, supported by forces from South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Thailand, and the Philippines. The war was now a colossal undertaking. The staggering cost in blood and resources reached levels no one could have predicted 4 years earlier. The new president knew the truth. The war could not sustain its current intensity forever. The American public was bitterly divided. Anti-war protests were an everyday reality across the United States. Meanwhile, honest military assessments painted a harsh picture. The communist insurgency in the South retained immense operational strength. They were steadily supplied by the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, pushing reinforcements through Laos and Cambodia along that vast network known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. During those early weeks in office, he addressed the National Assembly. He met foreign delegations. He began the slow, quiet work of building the networks that would ultimately define his presidency. Those who watched his rise described a man who was deeply cautious, patient, methodical, often entirely unreadable behind closed doors. Some peers called him the old fox. It fit him perfectly. He listened far more than he spoke. He committed to nothing without endless thought, always keeping his options open until the very last second. 1967 ended in Saigon with a strange mix of cautious hope and creeping dread. American intelligence caught communist forces preparing something massive for the new year. The exact scale and timing, a total mystery. Some American commanders brushed it off as routine. Others saw the storm coming. The President of the Republic of Vietnam signed off on security measures matching the intelligence he received. He braced for a difficult winter. For the upcoming Lunar New Year, the biggest event in the Vietnamese calendar, he planned to leave Saigon. He would join his wife's family down in the Mekong Delta in My Tho. That holiday arrived in late January 1968. And what happened across the country during those first dark hours of the lunar year would test everything: his presidency, his army, the entire American war effort. Independence Palace was about to face a nightmare nobody saw coming. In 1968, the Lunar New Year landed on January 30th. According to the traditional zodiac, it was the year of the monkey. Across the Republic of Vietnam, families started their customary preparations weeks early. Homes were swept completely clean. Ancestral altars overflowed with fresh flowers and offerings. The military even relaxed travel orders so soldiers could make it home, thanks to a deep-rooted tradition that had somehow survived years of conflict. A ceasefire usually took hold during the Tet holiday. The whole country simply stopped to breathe. Seeking a quiet holiday, the President of the Republic of Vietnam traveled down to My Tho in the Mekong Delta. When the first strikes hit, he was about 70 kilometers south of Saigon. Shortly before dawn on January 31st, the first wave struck. Coordinated assaults erupted everywhere in the pitch black. Communist forces mixing northern units from the People's Army of Vietnam with the National Liberation Front in the south struck all at once. Over 100 cities, towns, and military bases were targeted. The provincial capitals of Hue and My Tho were squarely in the crosshairs. Saigon was bleeding from multiple points. That included the United States Embassy, where a tiny commando squad breached the walls before military police gunned them down, creating one of the most defining, heavily televised images of the entire war. Down in My Tho, the president received the news in jagged pieces. Frantic phone calls, static on the radio, urgent cables from the Joint General Staff. By daybreak, the sheer scale of the horror was undeniable. The communists had unleashed their long-awaited general offensive, and the surprise was absolute. Defending Saigon in those critical early hours fell to the man left behind, the vice president. Air Marshal Nguyen Van Thieu had seen his actual power shrink lately, and his relationship with the president had grown icy. But suddenly, he was the one commanding the city's defense. He threw police, military, and local forces straight at the infiltrators. Urban combat raged for days. It was a brutal, neighborhood-by-neighborhood bloodbath. The presidential residence was locked down. Independence Palace took heavy fire, but ultimately stood firm. In the years that followed, the vice president earned widespread praise for keeping his nerve when the Capitol burned. As soon as security permitted, the president rushed back to Saigon. The damage, both military and political, was staggering. Estimates later showed over 14,300 civilians dead, 24,000 wounded, 630,000 new refugees poured onto the roads, joining the 800,000 already displaced by the war. 70,000 homes lay in absolute ruin. For the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the bloodshed was unprecedented. Around 27,915 soldiers would die in the calendar year that followed. Strictly by the brutal arithmetic of war, the offensive was a colossal communist defeat. The grand civilian uprising they banked on simply never happened. The National Liberation Front had spent over a decade quietly building their military network in the South. Now it was crippled beyond repair. And those People's Army of Vietnam units sent into the city streets, they were practically wiped off the map. But politically, the outcome was a catastrophe for the South. The assault completely broke the American public's faith in the war. Walter Cronkite, the legendary anchor for the Columbia Broadcasting System, returned from Vietnam and looked right into the camera. He told millions of Americans the war was stuck in a bloody stalemate. Back in the White House, President Lyndon Baines Johnson watched that broadcast. Aides claim he knew right then losing Cronkite meant losing Middle America. The fallout was incredibly swift. By March 31st, the President of the United States announced he was stepping down. So now, the President of the Republic of Vietnam faced a dual nightmare. He had to rebuild a shattered military landscape, all while Washington underwent a massive political shift. The American war machine had hit a wall. Whoever took the White House next would inherit a tired public that refused to tolerate endless escalation. Trapped in Saigon, the president reacted with a string of emergency measures. Historians now view these as the defining domestic choices of his entire presidency. First came martial law on February 1st, officially granting the military powers they were already using anyway. The second move cut much deeper. He asked the National Assembly for a massive general mobilization. Following heavy debate, it passed in June. Draft ages plummeted, service limits expanded. By the end of the year, roughly 200,000 more South Vietnamese men were conscripted into the fight. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam started the offensive with 427,000 troops. Over the next few years, the armed forces would swell to a staggering peak of over 1 million men in uniform. The third measure arrived in July. A presidential decree launched a program called Phong Hoang, roughly translating to Phoenix. It was built hand in hand with American intelligence, specifically the Central Intelligence Agency under William Egan Colby. He ran the so-called pacification effort, aiming to utterly crush the communist infrastructure out in the rural villages. The Phong Hoang program pulled police, military, and local authorities together for one brutal task: find the hidden leaders of the National Liberation Front and neutralize them, capture or kill. Over the next 4 years, they claimed to have taken out more than 80,000 cadres. The raw brutality of those methods and the devastating human cost would haunt congressional hearings and history books for the next 50 years. The fourth measure was the absolute hallmark of his presidency. In the spring of that year, defying the unanimous counsel of his senior advisors, the president mandated a new paramilitary unit, the People's Self-Defense Force in Vietnamese, Lực lượng Nhân dân tự vệ. The concept was simple, yet politically audacious. Civilians too old or too young for regular military service joined a community militia. They received basic training and firearms to protect their own villages, neighborhoods, and hamlets. When the program reached its peak, roughly 4 million South Vietnamese civilians had enrolled. Around 600,000 weapons were handed out. Critics sounded the alarm, arming millions of civilians risked turning those very guns against the state. But the president pushed back. In archived arguments, he insisted that any government afraid to arm its own citizens simply did not deserve their loyalty. The program stayed active for the remainder of his presidency, and by and large, those weapons were never turned against the government. Across that autumn, the political landscape in the United States moved steadily toward its conclusion. The American presidential election was set for early November. The Democratic candidate, Vice President Hubert Horatio Humphrey, was heavily tied to the Johnson administration's war policies. Meanwhile, the Republican challenger, former Vice President Richard Milhous Nixon, campaigned on a promise to end the conflict with honor. Through the campaign's final weeks, President Johnson desperately sought a breakthrough at the Paris peace negotiations, which had begun earlier that year between American and North Vietnamese envoys. On October 31st, a bombing halt over the Democratic Republic of Vietnam was announced, but it was strictly conditional on South Vietnamese participation in the talks. What truly happened in those final days of the American campaign has slowly come to light through declassified materials. This includes the personal notes of Nixon's senior aide, Harry Robbins Haldeman, released by the United States National Archives in 2017. According to these records, the Nixon camp kept a back channel to the Saigon government. Their liaison was Republican fundraiser Anna Chennault, widow of the wartime aviator General Claire Chennault. She actively encouraged the South Vietnamese president to delay joining the Paris talks. Nixon's motive was purely political. Any peace breakthrough before the election would heavily favor the Democrats. Saigon's motive was entirely strategic. They calculated that a Nixon administration would offer far better terms than Johnson ever could. A counter-analysis,
published years later by the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, offered another angle. It suggested the Republic of China on Taiwan, led by Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, might have also influenced this back channel. Saigon's president was likely making his own strategic moves, not just following Nixon's orders. On November 12th, United States Secretary of Defense Clark McAdams Clifford issued a very public threat. If Saigon refused to attend the talks, America would proceed without them in Saigon. This landed as much more than standard diplomatic posturing. It was a dark reminder. 5 years earlier, President Diem had been assassinated with American knowledge. Ultimately, any Saigon government's survival depended entirely on American patience. The American election concluded the following week, handing the presidency to Richard Nixon. He would take office on January 20th of the new year. Waiting for him was an inherited war fundamentally transformed in scale, cost, and prospect by the outgoing year's events. For the President of the Republic of Vietnam, 1968 had been uniquely turbulent. He was absent from Saigon during the very offensive that almost shattered his government. He then passed the most consequential domestic legislation of his tenure, armed millions of civilians,
Positioned himself to negotiate with Washington's new leadership. And, as both contemporary observers and modern historians note, he began aggressively consolidating executive power. Authority was pulled tightly into his own hands, systematically sidelining the vice president, the legislature, and any potential rivals. The year closed with the country battered, yet still intact, and a new American administration was preparing to oversee the war's long, slow unraveling. The transition of power in Washington concluded on January 20th, 1969. Richard Milhous Nixon took the oath of office on the east front of the United States Capitol. He was now the 37th president. His inaugural address promised unity after a deeply divided decade, but it also sent a subtle signal, one that diplomats across the Pacific parsed with absolute precision. The new administration intended to draw down American military forces in Southeast Asia, chasing what Nixon would later dub peace with honor. The new administration's senior figures carried a foreign policy vision sharply distinct from the Johnson era. National Security Advisor Henry Alfred Kissinger, a German-born Harvard professor destined to become a towering force in American government, planned to strictly centralize foreign policy within the White House. Consequently, Secretary of State William Pierce Rogers often found himself pushed to the margins. Meanwhile, Secretary of Defense Melvin Robert Laird became the very public face of this new wartime strategy. That approach relied on two main pillars. First, a phased, gradual withdrawal of American combat forces. Second, a massive buildup of the Republic of Vietnam armed forces. The goal was to ensure Saigon could shoulder the fighting America was abandoning. The policy would receive its formal announcement later that year. But inside the administration, it already had a name: Vietnamization. The South Vietnamese president learned of this framework through standard diplomatic channels and directly from Ellsworth Bunker. Bunker was the American ambassador in Saigon, holding the post since spring 1967, and he would remain there throughout the Nixon presidency. The two men held regular meetings. Bunker later described his counterpart with characteristic diplomatic tact. He called the president shrewd and intellectually capable, noting his early commitment to constitutional governance over sheer military dictatorship. The two presidents held their first formal meeting on June 8th. The venue was Midway Atoll, the tiny Central Pacific naval installation, where American forces crushed the Imperial Japanese Navy back in 1942. The Midway Conference delivered two massive announcements. First, President Nixon publicly vowed to withdraw 25,000 American combat troops by late August. This was the very first reduction since the 1965 escalation. In return, President Thieu publicly agreed that South Vietnamese forces would steadily take on a heavier share of the combat burden. Behind closed doors, the South Vietnamese president despised the term Vietnamization. In documented conversations, he argued it falsely implied the war had been an exclusively American effort up to that point.
It completely erased the fact that his own army had been bleeding and dying long before American combat units ever deployed. The Pentagon firmly defended their branding. The word stayed. The sheer volume of military aid flooding into Saigon expanded dramatically. New M16 rifles, new M48 tanks, a fleet of helicopters, and fresh aircraft for the Republic of Vietnam Air Force. The regular army had already swelled past 500,000 troops during the previous year's mobilization, yet it kept growing. By the early 1970s, their total force structure would rocket past 1 million personnel. Expanding the army, however, did absolutely nothing to fix South Vietnam's toxic command culture. Senior generals were promoted, retained, and advanced almost entirely based on personal loyalty to the president, not actual battlefield competence. American military observers based in Saigon repeatedly flagged these deep concerns in cable traffic sent back to Washington. Meanwhile, General Creighton Williams Abrams Jr. had taken over as the new American commander, replacing General William Childs Westmoreland the previous June. Abrams favored a far more measured, combined arms approach to the conflict than his predecessor ever did. Abrams formed a close working relationship with General Nguyen Van Thieu, the acting chairman of the Joint General Staff. When the glaring incompetence of certain corps and divisional commanders became impossible to ignore, Abrams took those concerns directly to Saigon's highest offices. The president's relationship with the National Assembly, the legislative body established by the Second Republic's Constitution, also shifted during this time.
Critics watched these changes with mounting concern. In early 1970, the president sparked the biggest civil liberties controversy of his administration thus far. Assemblyman Tren Ngoc Cho, a member of the lower house, suggested sending a Republic of Vietnam delegation to Hanoi. The goal was direct talks with the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. This broke a strict political consensus. Everyone understood the war could never end through bilateral negotiations without American involvement. Cho was arrested. He faced a military court. The Constitution guaranteed immunity for legislators, yet this protection was stripped away using procedural loopholes. Foreign journalists and legal experts condemned the move as blatantly unconstitutional. In the end, Cho received a sentence of 10 years of hard labor. The case captured international attention, and the American press covered it relentlessly. Civil liberties advocates protested across both nations. Meanwhile, the president defended the prosecution as a wartime national security necessity. The legal foundations for this move remained bitterly disputed, not just for the rest of his presidency, but for years afterwards. Right as this controversy unfolded, the president signed his administration's most significant domestic policy initiative into law. The Land to the Tiller program, known in Vietnamese as Nguyen Van Thieu, had been brewing for over a year. South Vietnamese policy advisors and American agricultural specialists shaped it. They worked alongside academic consultants like Roy Lawrence Prostaman from the University of Washington. His previous research on land reform in developing nations heavily influenced the draft. Following an extensive debate, the National Assembly passed the legislation. On March 26th, the president flew to Can Tho, the main city of the Mekong Delta. He signed the bill into law during a massive public ceremony, a day the government officially declared a national holiday. The historical record preserves his exact remarks from that signing. He stood before the massive crowd and declared it the happiest day of his life. The program carried extraordinary ambition. Any parcel of land not directly cultivated by its owner would be handed over to the tenant farmer actually working it completely free of charge. The government would compensate the former landowners. They offered 10% of the value in cash and 80% in 8-year bonds redeemable on a strict schedule.
This massive commitment covered roughly 1 million hectares, about 2.5 million acres. Over 3 years, this land would pass to nearly 800,000 tenant farmers. The American government threw substantial financial weight behind the effort. They contributed roughly 339 million United States dollars toward a total estimated cost of 441 million. The international press reacted immediately, and the coverage was overwhelmingly favorable. The Washington Evening Star editorial board called the legislation the best news from the country since the Japanese occupation ended in 1945. Over at the New York Times, editors labeled it perhaps the most ambitious and progressive non-communist land reform of the 20th century.
Even the American congressional record from that era is filled with statements of support from senators across both major political parties. When measured against its stated goals, the actual implementation of the program met and sometimes exceeded those initial promises. 3 years later, the president wrote to his American counterpart to confirm the project was complete. By then, roughly 1,003,353 hectares had been handed out to about 858,821 former tenant farmers. At the start, farm tenancy plagued nearly 60% of the rural agricultural workforce. By the end, official government statistics claimed it had practically reached the vanishing point. Historians would spend decades debating how this program actually affected the relationship between rural populations and the Saigon government. Some experts, including Roy Prosterman, the American academic who helped shape the bill, argued it genuinely transformed South Vietnam's rural economy. They believed it shattered the appeal of communist land redistribution promises. Yet others, like post-war Vietnamese researchers, pushed back. They argued the policy simply arrived too late. It came at the 11th hour of a conflict whose military trajectory was already locked in, meaning its real impact on rural political loyalty remained severely limited. Whatever its final political impact, this reform ran parallel to another massive wartime development. That spring, the political landscape shifted dramatically in Cambodia, the kingdom bordering South Vietnam to the west. On March 18th, Prince Norodom Sihanouk was traveling abroad on a foreign visit. In his absence, the Cambodian National Assembly voted to strip him of his title as head of state. Power quickly passed to a new government under General Lon Nol. These new leaders made an immediate demand. They ordered the People's Army of Vietnam units to entirely withdraw from Cambodian territory. For years, communist forces had used the country as a safe haven and supply base, feeding troops down the trail network stretching from the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. The North Vietnamese simply refused. Instead, they expanded their operations in Cambodia, directly threatening the new government. President Nixon and his top advisors sensed a rare opportunity. By teaming up with the Saigon government and South Vietnamese armed forces, a joint cross-border strike could obliterate those deep-rooted communist supply bases in Cambodia. Crucially, it would buy precious time for the Vietnamization program to mature. The offensive kicked off on April 29th. American and South Vietnamese troops crossed the border simultaneously at several different points. Leading the South Vietnamese charge was 3rd Corps Commander Lieutenant General Do Cao Tri. He was a flamboyant, aggressive field officer, a man American journalists had started calling the Patton of the Parrot's Beak, named for the uniquely shaped Cambodian border region where the heaviest fighting took place. Roughly 8,700 soldiers from the Army of the Republic of Vietnam pushed into the Svay Rieng province across 12 battalions. Meanwhile, American forces pushing further north swept into a zone known as the Fish Hook. These operations ran for roughly 2 months. The Allied forces wiped out massive quantities of communist supplies, weapons, and fortified base camps. They seized huge stockpiles of rice, ammunition, and gear that had been gathering dust for years. Ultimately, the sweep fractured the entire logistical network supporting communist operations across the southern half of the country. In public speeches, President Nixon praised the incursion as the single most successful military operation of the entire war. General Abrams offered a similar military assessment, concluding the push had bought vital time for the Vietnamization process. Yet, back in the United States, the political fallout was disastrous. Expanding the conflict into Cambodia sparked the largest wave of anti-war protests seen on American university campuses thus far. This unrest culminated in the tragedy at Kent State University in Ohio on May 4th, where National Guard troops shot and killed 4 students. The South Vietnamese president had fully backed the operation, working hand in glove with American planners. Out in the field, his armed forces had handled their assigned roles with real competence. But when the joint offensive finally wrapped up in late June, the war had shifted into a completely new and deeply uncertain phase. This Cambodian success entirely reshaped the strategic calculations in both Washington and Saigon. The logic was simple. If a joint cross-border strike could wipe out communist sanctuaries in one neighboring country, why not try it again? The next target was Laos, the small, landlocked kingdom bordering the Republic of Vietnam to the west.
This was the exact route where the vast supply network, famously known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail, flowed south from the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Every senior commander on the American and South Vietnamese side grasped the strategic value of hitting that trail. It carried the vast majority of men, weapons, ammunition, food, and gear sustaining communist military operations in the South. Severing this lifeline at a critical choke point could cripple the communist war effort for months, maybe even years. The most tempting target was Chapon. It was a massive logistics hub roughly 40 kilometers inside Laotian territory, sitting right on Route 9, the main east-west highway cutting across the panhandle of southern Laos. But they faced one fundamental constraint. In late 1970, the United States Congress passed the Cooper-Church Amendment. This law strictly banned American ground troops or military advisors from operating inside Laos. If this cross-border strike happened, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam would have to go in entirely alone. They would only have the backing of American air power, American helicopters, and American artillery batteries firing safely from inside South Vietnamese borders. Planning started late in 1970, picking up pace into the new year. The American Military Command in Saigon, led by General Creighton Williams Abrams Jr., worked directly alongside the Joint General Staff under General Nguyen Van Thieu. Taking the ground force command was Lieutenant General Hoang Xuan Lam. He had led the 1st Corps Tactical Zone, the northernmost military region of the Republic of Vietnam since 1967. Lam was the president's long-standing political ally. His career progression had been incredibly steady, but his actual combat command experience, as multiple American observers noted, was pretty limited. They named the operation Lam Son 719. The title echoed the historic Lam Son uprising, led by the 15th century Vietnamese general Le Le against Chinese occupation. The numbers stood for the year and the route. The forces assigned to this push included some of the most elite units in the Army of the Republic of Vietnam: the Airborne Division, the Marine Division, the 1st Infantry Division, widely considered the finest infantry unit in the entire South Vietnamese military, armored cavalry regiments, ranger battalions, roughly 20,000 soldiers altogether. And supporting them were hundreds of American helicopters flying out of bases just inside the South Vietnamese border. The massive operation officially crossed into Laos on February 8, 1971. What happened next is heavily documented in American military archives, Joint Chiefs of Staff records, and post-war accounts from veterans on both sides. The communist response was much faster and far heavier than American and South Vietnamese planners ever anticipated. The People's Army of Vietnam threw 5 full divisions, hundreds of tanks, and dense anti-aircraft defenses right at the corridor.
Helicopter losses spiked almost immediately. Ground units found themselves pinned down at fire bases. They could barely reinforce them, and evacuating was nearly impossible. Progress along Route 9 slowed down. Then it just stalled completely. South Vietnamese forces were fighting without the embedded American advisors who usually accompanied them. Under heavy fire, they seriously struggled to coordinate combined arms maneuvers. When the presidential intervention finally arrived, it only complicated things further on the ground. According to several accounts, including Henry Alfred Kissinger's memoirs and testimony from senior American officers, the South Vietnamese president issued a confidential directive to General Lam. If South Vietnamese casualties hit roughly 3,000 soldiers, he was to curtail the operation entirely. The president simply calculated that he could not sacrifice all his elite units. He needed them to defend the country, naturally, but he also needed them for the upcoming presidential election later that year. When American commanders eventually caught wind of this directive mid-operation, they realized it was just one more chain restricting the campaign's freedom of action. By early March, the situation along Route 9 had deteriorated so badly that senior American commanders considered the whole operation effectively defeated. Saigon made a desperate decision. They would send in a more aggressive corps commander to salvage whatever could still be saved. They chose Lieutenant General Do Cao Tri. He was the flamboyant, hard-charging 3rd Corps commander whose work in the previous year's Cambodian operation earned him comparisons to General George Smith Patton Jr. in the American press. Tri had risen through the airborne forces. He had survived multiple assassination attempts over his long career. Political rivals exiled him in the mid-1960s, only for the president to recall him once they fell from power. By nearly everyone's account, he was the absolute most aggressive senior field commander left in the South Vietnamese Army. On February 23rd, while flying out to take over his new command, his helicopter went down. He died instantly, at the age of 41. That crash robbed the Army of its fiercest corps commander right when they needed him most. There was simply no equivalent replacement. The operation carried on under General Lam, shifting its objectives before finally pulling back. The South Vietnamese Armored Task Force made it to the outskirts of Chapone for a quick, symbolic raid, only to receive orders to retreat under brutal communist pressure. That withdrawal generated images that quickly circled the globe. South Vietnamese soldiers frantically clinging to the skids of American helicopters, lifting off from hot landing zones. For the international press, those photographs became the lasting visual summary of the entire campaign. The South Vietnamese president stood in public and declared the operation a success. Behind closed doors, most senior American commanders strongly disagreed. General Philip Buford Davidson Jr., the former senior intelligence officer for the American Military Command in Saigon, later wrote about it. He argued the campaign proved that Vietnamization had a very long way to go before South Vietnamese forces could launch major offensives without American command and logistics. The New York Times journalist covering the operation put it bluntly: the political claim of victory and the military reality on the ground were two entirely separate realities, somehow sharing the exact same news cycle. The operation formally ended on March 25th, but inside South Vietnam, the political fallout was only just beginning. The presidential election was set for October 2nd, less than 7 months away. According to the Second Republic's Constitution, drafted in 1966, the country required a competitive election with multiple qualified candidates. But in the months following the Laotian campaign, the president pushed through legislative and procedural actions that systematically choked off his potential challengers. He slapped new residency requirements, higher endorsement thresholds, and stiff procedural barriers onto anyone trying to run. Still, Lieutenant General Nguyen Van Thieu declared his candidacy. He was the respected public face of the 1963 coup against President Ngo Dinh Diem. Air Marshal Nguyen Cao Qui, the estranged vice president from the previous term, also fully intended to run against him. As summer dragged on, both opposition campaigns collapsed. The government enforced those new procedural rules in ways that neutral observers and the candidates themselves saw as perfectly designed for exclusion. General Minh pulled out entirely, publicly stating that the basic conditions for a free election simply did not exist. Marshal Key withdrew as well. Everyone else refused to enter. By midsummer, the presidential contest was a one-candidate race. The American government registered serious diplomatic concern through Ambassador Bunker and various back channels. Saigon noted those concerns, but they changed absolutely nothing about the political math. The President of the Republic of Vietnam fully intended to secure a second term. The constitutional process that elected him in 1967 was certainly not going to produce a competitive contest in the autumn of 1971. The vote finally happened on October 2nd. The official certified results were eventually published in international election records. They listed 7,192,660 registered voters. The government officially reported voter turnout at 87.97%. The president received 5,971,114 votes. That represented exactly 100% of the valid ballots cast. Meanwhile, 356,517 ballots, roughly 5.63% of the total, were marked invalid or left completely blank. Almost immediately, the interpretation of those numbers sparked a bitter dispute, one that continues to this day. The critical view was loud and widespread across the international press. The internal political opposition, and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam up north. They argued the election was just a managed formality. The entire political environment had been engineered to crush any genuine competition. In their eyes, that unprecedented turnout didn't show authentic popular support. It reflected sheer coercion, driven by the systematic mobilization of government employees, soldiers, and their families. A more favorable view was pushed by some American officials at the time, and later developed by historians like Louis Sorley. They argued the turnout figure was actually remarkable on its face. The communist leadership had actively called for a boycott, meaning anyone voting risked severe retaliation. According to this interpretation, achieving the highest turnout in Vietnamese electoral history under those dark conditions meant the public was actively choosing to participate in the constitutional process, rather than tearing it down. You cannot reconcile the two interpretations using just the surviving documents. Both theories rely heavily on guesses about voter motivation, assumptions that simply cannot be verified 5 decades down the line. Yet one thing is absolutely certain. The president took the oath for his second term, and the constitutional machinery of the Second Republic kept running. But ultimately, the political fallout of that election meant very little. The real story was the military crisis already gathering quietly across the northern border. In the final weeks of 1971, American intelligence analysts started seeing the signs. The People's Army of Vietnam was gearing up for an offensive on a completely unprecedented scale. The exact timing was vague. The primary targets were still being debated in briefing rooms, but the sheer mass of conventional forces gathering along the demilitarized zone, up in the Central Highlands, and right across the Cambodian frontier pointed to one grim reality. The war was entering a new, distinctly far more dangerous phase. The opening guns of that massive offensive finally tore through the silence at noon on March 30th, 1972, built on months of meticulous planning. The communist strategy demanded 3 coordinated strikes across 3 completely separate fronts. The northernmost assault punched straight through the demilitarized zone at the 17th parallel, the border separating the 2 Vietnamese states since the 1954 Geneva Accords. Heavily armored divisions of the People's Army of Vietnam, backed by artillery, surged south into Quang Tri Province, the northernmost territory of the Republic of Vietnam. A week later, the second thrust tore into the Central Highlands. Communist divisions marched on the cities of Kon Tum and Pleiku, completely overrunning the fire bases at Tan Keng and Dak To. Then came the third strike in the south. Forces pouring out of Cambodia pushed hard toward the provincial capital of An Loc in Bin Long province. They were now less than 100 kilometers from Saigon. The sheer scale defied belief. 14 infantry divisions, 26 distinct regiments, over 120,000 soldiers thrown at those three fronts. They brought roughly 1,200 tanks and armored vehicles straight from Soviet and Chinese stockpiles, and hundreds of artillery pieces, including massive long-range guns built to pound deep into South Vietnamese territory. Standing in their way was the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. They had grown significantly during the Vietnamization program, yet had never faced a conventional invasion quite like this. By the time the offensive began, the American ground combat footprint had shrunk to barely 70,000 troops, a number still dropping.
The crushing weight of the ground war was about to land squarely on the shoulders of the South Vietnamese. What the Americans could offer was support from the sky and the sea. President Nixon greenlit the most devastating air campaign of the entire war up to that point. Tactical jets, strategic bombers, helicopter gunships, and relentless naval barrages from the United States 7th Fleet just off the coast. Ultimately dubbed Linebacker, this operation rained sustained American firepower down on communist formations, a brutal escalation that would have been completely unthinkable politically just a year earlier. Up north, the defensive lines shattered almost immediately. The northernmost province fell to the newly formed 3rd Division of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. They had been thrown together just months earlier and had literally never fought as a unified group. Their field commander got almost no backing from his superior, Lieutenant General Hoang Xuan Lam. This was the exact same officer who had botched the Laotian border raid a year before. Lam tried running the defense from a desk down in Da Nang. He almost never went near the front. When his units were bleeding out under fire, his radio calls were scattered at best. On May 2nd, the provincial capital of Quang Tri City surrendered to the People's Army of Vietnam. It was the first time in the history of the Republic of Vietnam that a provincial capital had been completely overrun by communist troops. The shockwaves were instant. If Quang Tri could collapse, the ancient imperial city of Hue, a mere 60 kilometers south, was next. If Hue broke, Da Nang, the country's second-largest city, would be left entirely defenseless. And if Da Nang went down, they could lose the whole northern half of the country in a matter of weeks. Down in Saigon on that exact same day, American Commander General Creighton Williams Abrams Jr. fired off a frantic cable to Washington, addressing Secretary of Defense Melvin Robert Laird. The message, still sitting in the State Department archives, was brutally clear. Quang Tri City was gone. Hue and Kon Tum were likely next. The entire nation was sliding right into a catastrophic crisis. Abrams ended the dispatch by demanding that Ambassador Bunker set up an emergency face-to-face with the President of the Republic of Vietnam. They met inside the walls of Independence Palace on May 1st, with tense follow-up calls the very next day. Abrams walked in alongside Ambassador Bunker. They knew exactly what they had to say, and they knew it was going to be a massive insult to an allied head of state. Abrams simply handed his Washington cable to the president and told him to read the whole thing. The president stared at the pages. The room was totally silent. When he finally looked up, Abrams laid it out. State Department records show the American general looked the president in the eye and blamed the whole disaster on the glaring incompetence of his field generals. He listed them out by name. He called out the commanders in the Northern Military Region, the Central Highlands, and the Third Corps area.
Ambassador Bunker quickly wired Washington to brief National Security Advisor Henry Alfred Kissinger. His summary perfectly captured the ugly mood of that room. He told Kissinger they had pressured the president to take drastic action right then and there. Bunker noted they had made one point crystal clear. All the American bombers in the world could not fix a battlefield run by incompetent generals. The president sat there and took it. He said barely a word in response. But later that afternoon, he made a move historians now consider the most vital military decision of his entire time in office. He quietly stripped Lieutenant General Lam of his First Corps command. He handed the tactical zone to Lieutenant General No Quang Trung. Ask anyone in the American or South Vietnamese High Command, Trung was widely regarded as the most brilliant tactician in the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, a paratrooper who fought his way up the ranks. Back in 1968, he led the 1st Infantry Division through the absolute meat grinder of the Tet Offensive at Hue. Later, down in the Mekong Delta, running the 4th Corps, his ruthless campaign against corruption gave him a genuinely spotless reputation, a rare thing among the senior brass. General Abrams completely backed him, telling the president straight up that Trung was an absolute master of modern military leadership.
Trung boarded a flight north to Da Nang.
Just stepping onto the tarmac seemed to instantly steady the nerves of his exhausted troops. He gutted the old defensive strategy. He flew in battle-tested staff officers from his previous post. He set up hard radio links straight to the front lines, piece by piece, rebuilding the chain of command that his predecessor had let rot. The communist advance slammed into a brick wall. The defensive line finally held firm along the Mi Chang River in southern Guangxi province. Hue was saved. Meanwhile, the siege at An Loc became the ultimate defining symbol of South Vietnamese grit. Brigadier General Le Van Hung and his 5th Infantry Division, trapped inside the provincial capital, fought off 3 entire communist divisions for 66 brutal days. Just 7,500 starving defenders holding back a massive attacking force of roughly 21,000 men. The order from the president's office was chillingly simple. An Loc had to stand, no matter the butcher's bill. And somehow, they held the line. Military historian George J. Vieth later called the stand at An Loc the single most magnificent military achievement in the history of the South Vietnamese armed forces. Up in the Central Highlands, the troops at Kon Tum dug in too. They were led by Brigadier General Lee Tong Ba, alongside top American civilian advisor John Paul Vann, an ex-Army officer who had morphed into a genuinely massive figure in the war effort. Van died when his chopper went down in the jungle near Kon Tum on June 9th. But his city never surrendered. By late June, General Trong had pieced together a massive counterstrike in the north, codenamed Lam Song 72. The Airborne Division, the Marines, tough Ranger battalions, and the 7th Armored Cavalry began slowly grinding northward. They slammed straight into heavily entrenched communist units surrounding Guangxi City. It was the most savage, close-quarters combat of the entire offensive. South Vietnamese Marines spearheaded the brutal final push through the rubble. Finally, on September 15th, after 4.5 agonizing months of artillery fire and street battles, they took the city back. That final bloody push alone left almost 1,000 Marines dead. The offensive finally broke. The Republic of Vietnam survived the largest conventional military operation of the war. Communist forces suffered massive casualties, requiring years to replace. South Vietnamese troops held firmly, though their reliance on American air power remained absolute. Washington studied the aftermath. Vietnamization had passed a crucial test, yet true independence remained firmly out of reach. In Paris and Washington, the political fallout was immediate. Secret peace talks between America and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam had been running since 1969, led by Kissinger and North Vietnamese Politburo member Le Duc Tho. That autumn, negotiations rapidly accelerated. By October, both sides had initialed a draft agreement. The draft reached the President of the Republic of Vietnam. He flatly rejected it.
The terms allowed People's Army of Vietnam forces to remain on his soil after the ceasefire. He saw the proposed political mechanisms as a guaranteed path to a communist takeover. He fired back 69 amendments. The North Vietnamese absolutely refused to negotiate. America responded to this refusal in two ways. President Nixon sent his national security advisor straight to Saigon with letters designed to force an agreement. These letters, declassified decades later, mixed promises of continued backing with incredibly blunt warnings. On the 16th of January, 1973, Nixon wrote that America would initial the agreement on the 23rd, with or without South Vietnamese approval. If forced, Nixon would sign alone and publicly blame Saigon for obstructing peace. The penalty: an immediate end to all American economic and military aid, plus ominous warnings about unpredictable personnel changes within the South Vietnamese government itself. A previous letter from October was even more sinister. It urged the president to do everything possible to avoid a repeat of 1963, the very year President Ngo Dinh Diem was killed. The second American action was sheer force, resuming the intensive bombing of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Linebacker 2 battered the North for 12 days in late December. Roughly 200 B-52 strategic bombers pounded targets across Hanoi and Haiphong. By early January, the North Vietnamese returned to the table. They signed the Paris Peace Accords on the 27th of January, 1973. 15. The Republic of Vietnam's president signed under heavy protest. He only agreed after securing private written promises from Nixon if North Vietnam violated the treaty. America would strike back with full military force. Furthermore, essential economic and military aid would continue at survival levels. He never believed those promises would be kept. He signed anyway. No other choice. The much-anticipated Paris Accords ceasefire simply did not produce peace. Within hours of the agreement taking effect, both sides traded accusations of broken rules. The President of the Republic of Vietnam saw this coming. The night before the ceasefire, he telegraphed his commanders, ordering an operation known as flag flooding. Soldiers were handed 3 national flags each. Their orders: plant them everywhere. Every village, temple, school, bridge, and hilltop under government control. The goal was to visibly mark their territory and population before the ceasefire locked the front lines in place. Communist troops ran their own identical exercise. Bitter skirmishes broke out across dozens of disputed zones where neither side would yield. In the following months, the president laid out a harsh political doctrine that defined his remaining time in office. They called it the 4-No policy. No recognition of the communist enemy, no coalition government, no neutralism, no giving up territory. It was completely uncompromising, deliberately slamming the door on any of the political reconciliation the Paris Accords had supposedly set up. The American military withdrew right on schedule. By late March, the final combat troops were gone. A few American advisors stayed behind at the embassy and some defense attaché office sites, but the massive military machine that shaped operations since the mid-1960s vanished. General Frederick Carleton Weyand took over from General Abrams as the very last commander of the United States Military Assistance Command, just before the unit itself was dissolved. Back in Washington, the political landscape cracked wide open over the next year. The Watergate scandal had been brewing since summer, and it completely consumed Richard Milhous Nixon's presidency.
congressional support for sending military and economic aid to the Republic of Vietnam, already weak after the accords practically collapsed, funding was slashed. Those private assurances Saigon's president had secured about American military retaliation suddenly looked incredibly fragile. The man who made those promises was now fighting just to survive politically. On the 9th of August, 1974, President Nixon resigned. Vice President Gerald Rudolph Ford assumed the presidency. This new administration was politically fragile. Congress grew even less responsive to executive demands for Vietnam aid than they were just months earlier. The South Vietnamese president answered the decaying situation with one final show of offensive strength. That spring, the Third Corps under Lieutenant General Pham Quoc Tuan launched a preemptive strike on People's Army of Vietnam bases in Cambodia's Svai Rieng region. Starting the 27th of March, they achieved total tactical surprise. Over 1,200 communist soldiers died, 65 captured. South Vietnamese deaths stayed under 100. Supported by 45 daily Air Force sorties at the peak,
Yet Svay Rieng was the last major offensive the Army of the Republic of Vietnam ever mounted. Tactical success simply could not mask their total strategic exhaustion. The ultimate strategic crisis hit early in the new year. On the 10th of March 1975, Communist forces heavily attacked Buôn Ma Thuột, the main city of Dak Lak province in the Central Highlands. The strike blindsided the South Vietnamese command. Intelligence had pointed to a northern offensive, not the highlands. Defending troops from the 23rd Infantry Division under Brigadier General Nguyen Van Thieu were crushed within 24 hours. By the 11th of March, Buôn Ma Thuột fell. That same day in Saigon, the president called a meeting at Independence Palace. Declassified files now reveal it as the most consequential moment of his entire presidency. Just 3 other men sat in that room. General Nguyen Van Thieu, long-serving chairman of the Joint General Staff. Prime Minister Chen Thien Kim, a loyal ally since the political conspiracies of the early 60s. And Lieutenant General Dang Van Quang, National Security Advisor and the First Lady's uncle. On a small map of South Vietnam, the president sketched a radical strategy. Exposed, indefensible territory would be abandoned. The northern provinces of Quang Tri and Tua Tien Huay, the entire Central Highlands. Remaining resources would secure the populated lowlands, the Third Corps around Saigon, and Fourth Corps covering the Mekong Delta. The shorthand, light at the top, heavy at the bottom. A declassified memo from the Director of Central Intelligence later that year laid out the stark facts of the meeting. The president consulted nobody outside those 3 men. He never warned the Joint General Staff. He never warned the regional corps commanders who actually had to execute this massive retreat. He didn't speak to a single American official. On the 14th of March, the president flew to Cam Ranh Bay on the Central Coast. He met with Major General Pham Van Phu, the 2nd Corps commander controlling the Central Highlands. The order he delivered was simple on paper and catastrophic in practice. The 2nd Corps would abandon Pleiku and Kontum immediately. They had to retreat down Route 7 Bravo. It was a ruined secondary road through brutal terrain, untouched by major military traffic for years. The retreat started on the 16th of March. Within 48 hours, it shattered into absolute panic. Soldiers, their families, desperate civilians running from the communist advance, and old refugees all poured onto a road built for almost nothing. The communist forces saw exactly what was happening and cut into the fleeing columns at multiple choke points. Later academic studies and government files put the death toll in the tens of thousands, sometimes much higher. As a functioning military unit, the 2nd Corps simply ceased to exist. Up in the northern provinces, things were falling apart just as fast. On the 13th of March, before that Cam Ranh meeting, the president ordered the airborne division pulled from the 1st Corps to defend Saigon. He gave General Tung absolutely no strategic explanation.
After that, the general kept getting completely contradictory orders. Hold Hue, abandon Hue, hold Da Nang, evacuate Da Nang. Within weeks, the rigid command structure of the First Corps, the very thing Tung had rebuilt just 3 years earlier, completely dissolved. Hue fell on the 25th of March. Da Nang fell on the 30th. General Tung and his senior staff literally swam through the surf to reach South Vietnamese Navy ships offshore. He ended up hospitalized in Saigon, suffering what his officers called a total physical and mental collapse. The last real defensive line went up at Xuan Loc, a town in Long Can province where 5 major routes met, about 64 kilometers northeast of Saigon. It was the eastern gateway right into the capital. Defending it was the 18th Infantry Division, commanded by Brigadier General Le Minh Dao. They were never really seen as an elite army unit, but over the next few days, they would rewrite their own legacy in the most brutal, dramatic fight of the entire final campaign. The Battle of Xuan Loc kicked off on the 9th of April. The Communist forces threw in roughly 40,000 troops from the 4th Army Corps, led by Major General Hoang Cum. Barely 12,000 men held the town, backed by scattered South Vietnamese units nearby. The president's order to General Dao was absolute hold Xuan Loc at all costs. Outnumbered something like 7-1, the 18th Division dug in. They held that ground for 12 bleeding days. When they finally got the order to pull out on the 19th of April, the Communist 4th Army Corps had taken massive, self-admitted losses, and the defending division had lost well over 30% of its men. Xuan Loc finally fell on the 21st of April. That very evening, the President of the Republic of Vietnam went on national television. He spoke for nearly 3 solid hours. Much of it was completely off the cuff. He wept. He shouted. He tore into the United States government for breaking its promises for abandoning a country it had sworn to protect, using the most bitter language imaginable. He brought up all those old assurances from President Nixon, the promise that America would step in if the communists ever broke the Paris Accords. Not one of those promises, he told the nation, had been kept. He called America an inhumane ally. He called them irresponsible. And then he swore he would stay right there, fighting as a soldier alongside his men. But when the speech ended, he resigned. Power immediately passed to Vice President Nguyen Van Thieu. 4 nights later, on the 25th of April, the former president slipped out of Independence Palace in the dark. Thomas Polgar, the Central Intelligence Agency station chief in Saigon, quietly set the whole thing up. An American Air Force C-118 transport was sitting on the tarmac at Tan Son Nhat Air Base. The acting government had actually drafted a decree naming the former president as a special envoy heading to Taiwan for the funeral of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. The Generalissimo had died 3 weeks prior. The funeral was long over, but the cover story did exactly what it needed to do. The plane lifted off just before midnight. Watching from the tarmac were the departing former Prime Minister Trun Tien Kim, American intelligence analyst Frank Snepp, and a handful of officials quietly managing those final hours. The aircraft banked northeast, climbing high into the dark sky above the South China Sea. It carried the man who had ruled the Republic of Vietnam for nearly 10 years. He was flying toward a destination that would be just the first stop in an exile lasting the rest of his life. 5 days later, on the morning of the 30th of April, North Vietnamese tanks smashed right through the gates of Independence Palace. The Republic of Vietnam ceased to exist. That same aircraft carrying the former president out of Saigon touched down in Taipei during the early hours of the following day. His older brother, Nguyen Van Thieu, had been the Vietnamese ambassador to the Republic of China for years. Naturally, that diplomatic residence in Taipei became their first real sanctuary.
Former Prime Minister Chung Tin Kiem had flown in on the exact same plane. Meanwhile, the former president's wife, the First Lady for over 7 years, traveled out separately with their 3 kids. Now, the whole family was huddled together in an unfamiliar city. Ironically, they were sheltering in a country whose own government had been forced into mainland exile a quarter of a century before. Everyone knew Taipei was just a temporary fix, even if it dragged on much longer than expected. Those early days of exile were incredibly sensitive politically. The newly unified government in Hanoi, now officially the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, viewed the former president as a wanted war criminal. They leaned heavily on multiple foreign governments, demanding they deny him any safe haven. The Republic of China gave him that first refuge, but offering a permanent home would have tangled up their own foreign relations. Ultimately, the family stayed stuck in Taiwan for roughly 4 years. By 1979, the family packed up and moved to the United Kingdom. They found a quiet spot down in Surrey, just on the outskirts of London, where the former president bought a house he would stay in for the better part of a decade. His second son, Nguyen Quang Look, even went off to study at Eton College. They kept a remarkably low profile there. For years, the former president said almost nothing publicly. He would occasionally sit down with a persistent historian or journalist, but he deliberately stayed out of the diplomatic crossfire as Hanoi started stepping out onto the global stage. Moving into the early 1990s, the family packed up again, this time heading for the United States. They settled around Boston, Massachusetts, living first in Newton and later out in Foxborough. The move was simple enough. They just wanted to be near their kids, who had already finished school in the States and started building their own adult lives there. While living in Massachusetts, he only made a handful of public appearances. The biggest one happened out in Orange County, California, on the 16th of June, 1990. Around 500 people from the local Vietnamese American community showed up for the very first time. He spoke at length about how he actually left the country. He addressed those endless rumors about the missing national gold reserves, and he gave his blunt take on American policy during those bitter final years of the war. By 1992, he was openly criticizing America's slow push to establish ties with the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. That massive trade embargo locked in place since the war ended was eventually lifted in early 1994 by President William Jefferson Clinton. Full diplomatic relations were officially restored on the 11th of July 1995. Behind the scenes, the former president had apparently offered to help with those negotiations, hoping to get a better deal for the people who had fought for the South. The Clinton administration quietly turned him down. His final years were incredibly quiet. He went to Catholic Mass with his wife. He traded letters with old friends from the military and the fallen government men who were now scattered across America, Canada, France, and Australia. And every now and then, he would quietly sit down and talk with another historian writing about the war. Thursday evening, the 27th of September, 2001, he collapsed at his Foxborough home, a severe stroke. Paramedics rushed him to Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center in Boston, where doctors placed him on a respirator. Relatives traveled from across the country, desperate to be at his bedside. He died that Saturday evening, the 29th of September, 2001. He was 78 years old. The obituaries published by the international press attempted with varying success to summarize a life spanning decades of profound contradiction. The New York Times piece, written by veteran war correspondent Fox Butterfield, focused heavily on the former president's absolute reliance on a system of personal loyalty to govern his administration. Over in London, The Guardian offered a carefully measured look at his tenure. The Independent ran a detailed obituary by Judy Stowe, a longtime observer of Vietnamese affairs, and the Irish Times published a substantial assessment of its own. Taken collectively, the British and American press presented a deeply critical portrait, yet one that still acknowledged the sheer difficulty of his historical position.
Inside the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, the press barely mentioned his passing. But in the Vietnamese diaspora across the United States, Canada, France, and Australia, the coverage was extensive. Reactions swung wildly. Some papers printed sympathetic memorials, while others delivered brutal criticism, entirely driven by their political leanings. On the 20th of December, California Representative Zoe Lofgren submitted a formal tribute to the United States Congressional Record. Her statement was brief and entirely measured. She noted that the former president played a critical role in the histories of both his own country and the United States. His death, she stated, finally closed a truly sad chapter in the long relationship between the two nations. His body was cremated right there in Boston. To this day, the final resting place of his ashes remains a tightly kept secret. His widow revealed his last request. He wanted his remains brought back to his home village of Phan Rang. If that proved impossible, he asked that his ashes be scattered across the sea and the mountains of Vietnam. His wife survived him by another 2 decades. In 2009, she moved out to San Diego County in California to be closer to their eldest son. She passed away on the 15th of October, 2021, at 91 years old.
In the decades since his passing, the historical verdict on the man at the center of this story has never stopped shifting. One school of thought, led by American military historian Louis Sorley, argues that the Republic of Vietnam achieved far more under his leadership than the press ever admitted. This camp points to genuine progress. They highlight the new constitutional government, the land reforms that changed rural property rights, and the massive expansion of the armed forces. Local self-defense units gave remote villages a fighting chance, keeping society intact through years of brutal warfare. From this perspective, the total collapse in 1975 happened simply because America pulled its support, not because the South Vietnamese state was inherently doomed. Another view, backed by historians like the late Stanley Carnow and Gregory Daddis, paints a much darker picture. They argue the South Vietnamese state was structurally broken. Military patronage networks ran deep. Political dissent was crushed. The government relied entirely on American money and firepower. To them, these were not minor flaws, they were fatal. Under this interpretation, the Republic collapsed because of internal rot, something no amount of endless American aid could have ever fixed. These two sides have never found middle ground. The argument still rages today in academic journals, policy papers, and military seminars at war colleges across the United States. You hear it constantly in the memoirs and oral histories left behind by those who fought on both sides. Yet historians, military analysts, and careful observers keep coming back to a few key lessons from this man's life half a century later. The first is the heavy price of choosing loyalty over actual competence. The senior generals of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam were a fragile mix of genuine professionals and pure political appointees. That balance dictated the outcome of major battles throughout the entire war. The second lesson exposes the limits of foreign military help. American support kept the Republic of Vietnam alive for years on an unprecedented scale. But all the foreign aid in the world cannot replace the deep political and institutional foundations a society has to build for itself. The third reveals the absolute danger of a tiny, isolated circle making grand strategic choices. In the final weeks of the war, top leaders handed down orders without ever speaking to the field commanders doing the dying. The fallout from that isolation became completely irreversible in a matter of days. Lesson 4 highlights just how hard it is to maintain constitutional law while fighting a relentless war. The Second Republic of Vietnam tried to run a democratic state under total siege. The ugly compromises they made tore the system apart from the inside. The fifth points to the volatile nature of modern alliances. The bond between the Republic of Vietnam and the United States was massive, built on deep dependency. Yet shifting politics in both countries proved that no promise, no matter how firmly given, meant anything once the domestic mood suddenly changed. The sixth and final lesson is the simplest, yet easily the hardest to swallow.
War strips a leader down to their core judgment in the darkest, loneliest hours. The choices they make in that quiet room can never be undone. They simply harden into history. We want to know how you view these lessons and the complex life behind them. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Every different angle adds something real to the conversation. Keeping this history alive takes all of us. A man who climbed from a quiet coastal village to lead an entire nation. A man who stared down American presidents across conference tables, steering his country through the bloodiest years of the 20th century. In the end, he faded back into a private citizen. His name still sparks bitter debate, but his era is long gone. We are left not with a neat verdict, but a lingering question. How does leadership actually function or completely break down under pressures that no peacetime textbook could ever prepare you for? So we leave you with this. When history traps one person squarely between impossible foreign expectations, crushing domestic demands, and their own personal ambition, what can we fairly demand of them? And what is simply asking the impossible? Thanks for walking through this chapter of history with us on ARVN and United States Military.
If this one got you thinking, hit the subscribe button and let us know your take below. There are plenty more stories coming your way.